Greetings. This is the man who pretends to be Charles Darwin, and I'm here to talk to you about floating islands. Yes, you heard that right. Floating islands. Let me start with a book that I read several years ago by Alan de Queiroz called The Monkey's Voyage: How Improbable Journeys Shaped the History of Life. And he tells a lot of stories in here. One of them is about monkeys. Let me summarize it for you. That all monkeys and apes appear to have been a single genetic population about 40 million years ago. Now, it probably lived in Africa, and then some of those monkeys went to South America, where they evolved into different species of New World monkeys, which are very different from the Old World monkeys. In Africa, the Old World monkeys evolved into other kinds of Old World monkeys. Some of them evolved into apes, some of the apes evolved into chimpanzees, some of the chimpanzees evolved into humans. The question then arises, what caused them to split up into different populations, particularly the New World versus the Old World populations 40 million years ago? Well, anyone who has looked at a map of the world, and when we were little kids, I think I was in 4th grade, we were looking at a map and we said, you know, it looks like South America could fit right into Africa, that the east coast of South America could fit right into the west coast of Africa quite nicely. We thought that was just an interesting story, but since the discovery of continental drift, it has become not only a possibility, but is in fact a certainty, because South America and Africa are still moving apart from one another at the rate, as we teach our students, about the same as what fingernails grow. You wouldn't notice it much during a lifetime, but over the course of millions of years, that could add up to a lot of distance. To the, in fact, over 1,000 miles that we see today between the two continents. So this is now a certainty. Here is a problem, I hope you notice, that the South Atlantic Ocean opened up and continental drift started to occur about 110 million years ago, whereas the split between Old and New World monkeys occurred about 40 million years ago. What was happening during that 70 million years? Well, during that 70 million years, the South Atlantic Ocean was getting wider, and by 40 million years ago, it was already several hundred miles wide. Not as wide as it is today, but certainly wide enough that no monkey could swim across. The explanation that de Queiroz gave was that the monkeys took their voyage on a floating island. That seemed a little bit incredible to me. When I heard of floating island, I thought of Scheherazade, or I thought of Calypso's island, or something like that. But I thought the DNA evidence is clear, that must have been what happened. But what I had in mind was a mass of driftwood floating across the sea, not getting waterlogged, not sinking, and meanwhile the monkeys were clinging for dear life to the pieces of wood. Now, this could have happened, but I wasn't very convinced by it. But you see, I was thinking of a mass of driftwood, but a floating island is not a mass of driftwood. What it is, it's an actual forest where you have trees, some of them up to 30 feet tall, trees bound together by their roots. So the floating island is actually an entity held together by the tree roots. And of course, in the trees, there were animals such as monkeys, and historical accounts of floating islands even said that livestock could be found upon them sometimes. And so the tree roots bound them together into an actual floating island. The water would rise and cause the island to float downriver, if it's a large river, and float out into the ocean and even get into the Gulf Stream and travel in the ocean. Now, one question is, why is it that the island would float instead of sinking? What was it that buoyed the island up? Well, it would be decomposition, producing carbon dioxide and methane. And so this is apparently a real event. Floating islands. And there are, in fact, numerous historical references to floating islands, 3 or 4 each century, at least when records started to be kept in the 19th century, for example, and the 20th century. I first read about this in a book not by a scientist, but by a science writer and journalist, Edwin Way Teale. The book was North with the Spring. Let me read to you his account of a floating island. The most dramatic instance of a seagoing island occurred in 1893. In the spring of that year, a ship sighted a landmass drifting in the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida. Almost 2 acres in extent, with trees rising as high as 30 feet, it was visible from a distance of 7 miles. Its subsequent wanderings are preserved in government records. Traveling slowly northward in the Gulf Stream, it reached the latitude of Wilmington, Delaware by the latter part of July. Delaware, 1893. I bet Joe Biden could have seen it. He was a little kid in 1893, wasn't he? Anyway, a month later, ships sighted it on a line with Cape Cod. It slowly veered toward the Grand Banks and then followed steamer lanes toward Europe. By land, had wandered to a position northwest of the Azores. Whether it eventually reached the coast of Europe or broke up in the October gales, no one knows. So apparently, floating islands are, while they are rare on the time scale of human life, they are quite common over the course of centuries, millennia, certainly over the course of millions of years. What I learned from this was that you can't just go out in the forest and look at what's happening and figure out evolution from that. You have to consider rare events that occur. What on an evolutionary time scale is quite common, several times a century. That could have been thousands of times over millions of years. This also shows the evolutionary importance of rare events. And I got that not from reading another scientist, but by reading a nature writer. This is the man who pretends to be Charles Darwin. Tally ho, and amen.